Good afternoon, evening, morning, or what it is. My name's Steve Marvel. This is Crucial Survival, and this is part two of a series on coping in a crisis. I am here again with Graham Sorblick, and he is a results coach with a specialty in trauma. Nice to see you again.
Great to see you, Steve. Happy to be here.
Yeah. So I was wondering, could you just give us a brief overview of what we talked about last time and where we're going to lead into in this interview?
I believe last time the main takeaway from that was this kind of acceptance for, what we experience around us. Very deep kind of acceptance to the point where, we're just not so much at odds with the events and circumstances that are happening around us, particularly in critical situations. Excuse me. And really kind of preparing ourselves for how we want to show up, particularly if we know that we're going to intentionally put ourselves in a critical situation, whether it's in the wilderness or whether it's just relational, in our business, for a team leader, for in a marriage, how do we want to show up, or a parent, how do we want to show up? And at some point, we know that life can take turns and we can be faced with crisis and critical situations. So I think, that was the premise of the last interview, was just how we're going to show up and be in a greater sense of acceptance for that.
Yeah. Okay. So just my definition of a crisis, and I'm sure you'll give your as well, is that essentially you found yourself in a situation, and this is particular to the sort of things I train for, is where an emergency or crisis occurred. It's sort of defined by the fact that all of your preparation and the tools that you've put in place have been overrun, and the situation is escalating, and you've got to do something about it, or it's going to escalate out of control and beyond your control. So how does that tie in with your definition of crisis?
Gosh, I think that's an excellent description and definition of what crisis is, particularly for this discussion. And so I couldn't add a thing to that. That's perfectly, I think, perfectly descriptive. And one of the things that I thought was really interesting about that particular description is being overrun, your tools and preparation, expertise. And certainly, I think that's kind of the crux of the issue is, if we're being overrun, I suppose I would be interested in talking about what exactly are those parts that we brought to a situation that are being overrun. And then are there other resources and tools that are available to us in the situation that we're just unaware of? Maybe we do have other things at our disposal, resources, tools, a way to show up. Yeah.
Are you talking about psychological tools?
Yeah.
Or you're looking about improvising with respect to your surroundings, if you like? Or I'm not.
Yeah. Okay. So certainly, on one hand, we'll have all of the preparation. So we're going into let's just actually put ourselves in a group situation. We're going out into the wilderness. And I like this because, maybe you're just on a family outing and you want to take the family out for the weekend, and go camping, so forth. But you actually are well prepared. You've educated yourself. You've been out in the wilderness many times. You have experience. You have all the equipment. And you've even possibly have done some mental training to develop a sense of mental toughness in critical situations. You can, train in all sorts of ways for that. Now, so let's just assume that all of those things are in place, but then there is another psychological aspect to it where I would say that there may be some blind spots and there may be some other hidden resources, which will, and they may present themselves as limitations, but that's kind of the discussion is if we're going to prepare ourselves for a crisis, how can we better, assuming that we're smart enough and intelligent enough to prepare with equipment and just our general wherewithal, how to read a map and those practical things and to be prudent. Yet here's the possibility that, when things go into crisis in critical situation, well, maybe there's, like I said, a way we respond in the moment that is not necessarily, is limited. And so I guess where I'm going with that is, what are these potential limitations? What are these potential blind spots? What are we missing so that we're better prepared? And what I'm proposing here is that on one hand, we can accept that we can prepare as best as we can, and it's never going to be, absolutely sufficient for every situation.
Well, yes, of course, luck is going to play a part quite often. Even in a survival type situation, the weather, the equipment failure, even as something as simple as a storm's coming and you have a flat tire. And for whatever reason, this feat can be considered an emergency, not necessarily life-threatening, but this is in some way a crisis with two children screaming in the back of the car. Yeah, this is a critical situation, and because it will quite potentially escalate with those children getting more and more ratty, and you're panicking, and you haven't got your phone signal, and this can carry on. So who is it that might find themselves suffering with these blind spots?
I think that's a great question, because I think you hit it, that crisis tends to be is kind of a form of suffering. It's not necessarily the event as critical as the event can be, and even a flat tire on the side of the road with a family can be incredibly dangerous. And so what you're describing is, okay, so there's the situation, there's the event at hand, but then there's this relational aspect where the kids are upset. Your partner may be activated, maybe they're not thinking that you're handling the situation right. So it can escalate very quickly into a even worse situation where then you're further limited. And so my work in trauma is investigating and kind of delving into what those limitations are, so that if we are facing a situation, we want to be resourced. We want to be flexible in our response to a situation. And yet, when things come up, so I have a great example for this. And I saw a documentary recently. It's called Free Solo, and I can't remember the gentleman who is a world-class mountain climber. And
I can't remember his name either.
Yeah, free solo means you're alone on the side of a mountain without ropes and all the equipment, or a belay team, which are the people who would partner with you to, if you fell, you'd be tied off. They would, assist you to get back.
Otherwise known as insane, I think.
So this is very interesting. So for you and I, is absolutely insane, and yet for these a lot of these guys don't make it, but I don't know I think it might be like half of them may at some level. It's a really stark contrast with the guys who make it and the guys who don't on these free solo climbs. But here they are, they're putting themselves in a very critical situation. You and I would be certainly in a crisis. And so here's this guy who, he's climbing El Capitan in Yosemite. And the guy's cool as a cucumber. He has it all mapped out. He's not in crisis. He's very well resourced and he's in control. And yet he has a girlfriend that, he winds up developing a relationship with, and as soon as he partners with her and she starts to climb with him, things fall apart very quickly. So here's a great example of.
Is that because he perceived that he being protective, therefore his definition of crisis is changing, or is there some deeper, deep-rooted thing that's going on here?
Well, for example, in the movie, they were only up maybe 20 feet or so on the side of, they were practicing, and she made a mistake. He fell, and there was a lot of guilt and embarrassment and a lot of hard feelings, and he didn't know if he wanted to break up with her. So yes, my answer is yes. There was something else going on here. So in a much more minor situation, he's not on the side of a mountain alone. He's in a relational situation, and so here's where things fell apart, and he was limited by something that became really evident. I thought that was my biggest takeaway from this, is that there was something that happened in his life, an event, or actually a series of events, where in a relational context, he was not resourced well enough. There was something that happened that would limit his choices in the future in just having a really simple relationship. And so in a crisis, what we're describing is we can be all tooled up and prepared on one hand and doing our very best. On the other hand, there may be, in the moment when things get real, and you can also see this during birth, when people attend birth, how their response there, and the way people respond during death. Not necessarily the people who dying. Not a lot of people live to tell.
Yeah.
But the people around the person who may be dying have a certain response. For example, I was in Yosemite last winter, and somebody on the trail passed away. Now, a lot of people were responding very well. This was certainly a crisis. They were on the situation. Anybody who knew CPR or any kind of had any kind of medical wherewithal were on the job. And some people were incredibly, not necessarily handling it so well. So there's all sorts of responses. So I guess where I'm going with this is, what are those things that would, anything that would happen to us that would then limit our choices in the future?
Yeah, this an interesting. I don't know if it's an officially titled rule, which is the 10-80-10 rule, of how an individual might respond immediately to a crisis. In that 10% of the people are on it, absolutely on it. The 80% of the people are in one way or another stunned, be that for a little bit or maybe even minutes, they're just not with it at all. And the last 10% are the people that make inappropriate action, utterly inappropriate. It might be fighting the emergency service. It might be re-entering the building that's on fire. And the person that told me this, and I thought it was amazing that he did. He's an RAF survival and SEER instructor, but also mountain rescue in the UK. And he was performing an exercise within mountain rescue, and a colleague of his fell down a small, albeit small, cliff, and there he was, not moving. And this guy was like, "This would be a great photograph." And all of a sudden, it's like, "Wow, that is not the way to cope with this situation." And that I say it's I've called it and taught it as the 10-80-10 rule, but somebody has as hard, like you say, someone who has mental toughness, training, and practice. You never know what it is that caused him, whether or not that was something deep seated.
That's right. And so another way to look at it, I would say, is like, if we're going to get in a car and drive around, there may come a day where you get in an accident, you actually hurt somebody. Well, you don't want to wait to that day to say, well, I'm going to be a lot more safe in my car. And what I'm getting at is there is an area, a part of our psyche, and it's very much where our intuition resides. It's very much where our, I would say, that connection to the world around us, that I would suppose that kind of oneness. So when you're in nature, you feel a lot of this, and sometimes when you're in a loving relationship, you feel that connection. And a lot of these, those you just feel very open and resourced, and potentially vulnerable as well. But there's some safety there, and so what I'm saying is a really intelligent approach to preparing for critical situations, for crisis, for life, the beginning of life or the end of life, if that's, also we can talk about that, or relationships. It would be really smart to kind of delve into this part of us and have equal respect for the part that we know well enough, the part that we pay so much attention to, which it was kind of our first talk, which is how we show up and this acceptance of this part, that we are flawed and we are doing our best, yet there's this other part. And when we're resourced and we spend enough time cultivating that gut intuition, it's a tremendous resource. And so I don't know if I mentioned this, but if there were any of the drama and crisis and loss that we experience in the world, there wouldn't necessarily be any suffering around it if we were resourced in this way. We would be sad. I mean, and there's kind of a sweetness in that too, of course. But then we would regulate very quickly and come back to a sense of being present and available, and having our this gut intuition available to us to then just handle the situation without so much confusion or suffering around it. And so I guess what I'm saying is I kind of like to look at these two parts of us, one as this part that we are so familiar with, and this part that we interface with every day, and this other part that's a little bit mysterious, which is our intuition, which is this part of us that has a very clear and deep connection to the world around us and to the people around us. But this is the part that tends to be where those blind spots are, and only show up in a critical situation because we're not necessarily cultivating and preparing this part of us that actually would help us regulate. So if we go into fight, flight, or freeze, we would recognize that very quickly as kind of a primal animal instinct, and then regulate very quickly and say, well, I get it. There's that part of me that is going, having this physiological response, but there it is. I'm not caught up in it.
Yeah. Is this the gut feeling that you'll see on the cop dramas where they go, I've got a gut feeling about this? Are we talking about the same still? It sounds flippant, but are we talking about that? The older detective having that gut feeling because he's experienced, because he's been there, because he's had that conversation, because he has a sense of the type of criminal, he's got the sense of the environment. And maybe he can't necessarily put his finger on it as such or describe it, but and I've had it in planning. There is on a lifeboat when there's you're doing an emergency service. There is no prescribed everything. Sometimes, in terms of planning, you have a dynamic risk assessment, and then you slim things down, and then sometimes you just got to make a gut decision. That's just a thing. Is that are we talking about the same gut here, or are we?
Yeah, and so
we're
absolutely talking about the same thing. And what it is, it's actually an internal wisdom that shows up when you trust it well enough. Actually, there's a practice around that where you can develop a deeper trust of that, one of the things that would limit us from doing that is that wisdom is coming from, and that gut is it's very much like our truest self. It's where like I said, this inner genius and wisdom, and that's what makes those those detectives so incredible. Those those detective novels and the spy novels so intriguing, because they do have this other sense, and they trust it, and they train in trusting it. And so it's absolutely what I'm saying. And sometimes it takes over, and you hear these stories about mothers who save their children from an overturned car and things like this. And so it is this part of us. And if we had as much respect for this part of us and reverence, and we married the two, with equal respect, the part that we absolutely know and can and have control over, and then this other inner wisdom. And I think where I was going was that if there is truth in this wisdom, and there is a deeper sense of clarity there, and so when things get critical, there would be a much more we would be much more resourced with information rather than being overwhelmed by the event. So
Yeah.
the reason why we don't spend a lot of time with this is for two reasons. One is that we often confuse big emotions with our gut, and we just don't. We're not practiced in this, so we don't trust it, because a lot of times what we think we're listening to our gut, we're listening to big emotions, and it's steering us in the wrong direction. So another reason why we're not really intimate with this part of us is that there is more often pain in truth. So that in order to connect with this part of us, there's often things that have happened in the past that had to shut this part down necessarily to protect us.
I see.
So that we would, we won't go there unless we start to begin to see the value of it, and we have help and safety to be vulnerable enough to then begin to delve into this part, and which is our intuitive inner wisdom.
And so you say that is a blocker. Is that an event or series of events that might have happened in your childhood, or whatever it might have been?
So for example, absolutely. And it's not always necessarily so, but most of the time, more often, it is the case that, for example, this gentleman in Free Solo, and I thought that this documentary just expressed this so well, that here's a child who wasn't held well enough. He wasn't given a relational context for being open and vulnerable and exploratory. His father was really controlling and distant in these different ways. So when it came to him, so he channeled all of his focus into this solo event, mountain climbing by himself. But when it came to a relational context, it was crisis, and it's not, and he had an amazing partner. If it wasn't for her deeply rooted love for him and her deep sense of morality for, this relationship, it would have just fallen apart. But she carried him through, and he got to then feel safe enough to begin to become whole again, and go back and be, reconnect with this part of him that was necessarily shut down because in an earlier, and it wasn't necessarily the event. So to answer your question more specifically, it's not necessarily the events. It wasn't the fact that his parents didn't love him. Okay. It's that because they did, but there was something missing, and it wasn't the event or the events. It was part, the series of events where he wasn't responded to well enough over, enough times, yet it was his response to the events. And here's the beauty in that.
See. Yeah.
It's his, as a child has a natural response, they'll shut down a part of themselves just to protect themselves, so that they're no longer hurt by this person that they idolize is actually no longer available to them in a certain way. So they'll shut down that need to connect there.
I see.
Okay, so then that now later in life, that protected him. It was very good for him as a child, later in life, it became a real trouble for him, right? So it's not
So
the
how it,
event, yeah, it's the response, which became later a limitation. And we can undo that. The beauty of that is we can take responsibility for that
I was going to
and
ask
undo it.
I was going to ask the question, in fact, is that if you are considered mentally tough,
Mm-hmm.
and in various and numerous situations, you can cope and are connected with your gut, this inner wisdom, as you say. But in certain critical situations, you may have a blocker.
Mm-hmm.
What do we do about that? What do we do to have not universal, but to be unblocked as much as possible in preparation to use this wisdom should we meet some crisis in the future?
Well, that's tough. I mean, that's where we live and learn. And this is kind of go back to the example of, you don't want to wait till you hurt somebody, and you're driving around in a car before you decide to be a little bit more
Yeah.
intelligent than that and prepare. But here's the thing, like what I'm talking about, you have to be incredibly intentional about it, and there isn't really a forum there, or a wide, it's not necessarily in our educational system. It's not necessarily in the relationships that we came up in. It's the rare individual and the rare family, the rare community that actually fosters this kind of this respect and reverence for this part of us. I mean, we see it in indigenous cultures where there is almost no separation between this uh, this reverence for the spiritual, intuitive connection, this connect part of us that's connected to the world, and then our culture, which is incredibly distracted from that part of us, and we spend all of our time kind of idolizing this other part of us, which is just and so what I'm saying is I don't want to make it wrong. So the mental toughness training and all the preparedness and this, the wilderness survival, the survivalist trainings, and even those guys that are super, the real mental toughness guys, the Marine trainers and those guys, like that's all good and well too, because I mean, as long as you have respect for this other part of you, yet to go back to your question, man, if you're in a situation that's critical and you're in a crisis and you're stuck, well, then hopefully, it may be a hard lesson, I mean, if you're stuck, you're stuck. And if you have enough wherewithal to just step outside of the part that is stuck and say, oh, there's that part of me that I know, there it is again. You have a chance, as long as your awareness says, oh, I am not falling apart here. I am not failing in this situation. I am not the one who is inept here. There's just a part of me that's stuck.
So you are, in that case, given that there exists this blockage within this crisis, you are managing the blockage, and then becoming reconnected and using that tool within the situation as it would be should it not be blocked. That's very, very interesting. It's always amazing the variety of situations where gut instinct is it's just incredibly useful, and sometimes the only I've lost me the only channel. And though it might be considered by some people a spiritual
Certainly.
thing, it's very, it might just be simply a physiological connection. Is it a spiritual connection? Is it a lizard brain? Some people say, oh, it's lizard brain, but equally, I am, when I'm using my gut, I am observing consciously the signals I'm getting. It's not simply a response.
Exactly. I would. So, in other words, in that critical situation, in a survival situation, where you have a group of people, or at least one other person with you, and regardless of the event, you wouldn't necessarily, if you were fully resourced in this way, you're fully in contact with this part of you, and you paid an equal amount of respect to it to prepare yourself. Well, then it just wouldn't matter. That's what I was kind of saying earlier. All of the drama in the world, whether it's in your relationships, whether it's within your own inner turmoil, or if you're a team leader at your job or business, well, you wouldn't be so disturbed by the event or the people that are maybe making mistakes or putting themselves in harm's way, or upsetting you in some way. It wouldn't actually be that. You would just see the event as what it is, and you would have a way to respond to it that was married to this inner wisdom and this gut feeling that would guide you, and it will always be true. It will, and that's a big statement, and I'm putting my whole everything that I know behind that, everything that I know about myself and the world around me, that if you really do trust this part of you and you develop that inner resource, and you have as much respect for this part of you to then cultivate that and deepen that connection, you can always trust it. It's always true, and it will never mislead you. The trick again there is to not mistake it for big emotions, and to really get good at that distinction.
Yeah, it's a wonderful way of you've encapsulated and explained that so much better than I could have attempted to, and brought to me again new wisdom, and think that I've always been a fan of the gut, but now to think of it as inner wisdom, to think about blockages and how we are consciously interacting with both, is a constant education. The last interview was another education. It's much appreciated. So I wondered to myself, we're talking about gut, and we're talking about relationships. How will we update our thoughts on groups in this kind of crisis? Because I've taught in schools, and the group dynamic changes with a number of people and the ages and all sorts of things. And in survival training, quite often we are teaching people to survive as individuals. Even if it's a number of people that know themselves, it's only when you're doing family training, it might be dads and lads, or mums and daughters, or whatever it might be, that these will be considered people that are training do maybe together. But generally speaking, the training that I do is associated with individuals. So how might we consider crisis, the guts showing up in terms of larger groups?
Well, I think that it's really important to start with the individual, because when you focus on yourself and you develop this inner state, you develop this respect and this resource within you, so that it's readily available. It's more accessible to you. It becomes more of a resource for you. Well, then you show up for the group better. Now, when you put yourself in a group situation, there's entirely exercises and practices that you can do, because a group, and there's actually what really interesting. Like I love to kind of nerd out on science and math, and science and math is coming around to explain this in beautiful ways, particularly in math. And I won't go off on a tangent, but I have to mention that there was recently a German fellow who won like one of the highest math prizes in the world because he was able to recognize a formula that would that can essentially solve any problem for randomness. So, for example, if a drop of water hit a paper towel and splashed, the splash actually has an equation that would explain this incredibly random event. Beautiful, beautiful mathematics, and science is doing the same thing to help bring harmony to chaos. In a group situation, you have a tremendous opportunity to create more coherence, harmony, and a higher level of engagement in a chaotic situation. If you prepare the group becomes a structural support system energetically, intuitively, if everybody's on the same page with the same intention to respond to a situation the best they can. So for example, if a group gets together as, these individuals who then has an equal reverence for the power of the group, well, that creates a magnifying effect, and it's accelerator, and it's an amplifier for this consciousness that we're talking about, for the intuition. So in a group situation, you may have a much greater. Now, we all have the experience, though, of being in a group that devolves to a terrible, it could take one bad apple and all of a sudden the whole thing kind of falls apart. And you can see an organization fall apart very quickly, particularly if at the top levels, the group consciousness level is not held well enough. So it does take a kind of a leader or a sense of cooperation among the group to develop this kind of structural system. But then it carries with it much more power and a sense of structural support for survival, for responding to critical situations. And that's a dynamic that I've actually experienced because I've had the opportunity, the really wonderful opportunity to go out into the wilderness with some pretty highly functioning people, and it's a really, really great treat to be able to experience that.
Yeah. So we're talking about you were saying about blind spots and blockers. Mm-hmm. Are there a particular type of person or that might suffer more than another type of person with these sorts of blind spots? Is it something that one might observe in oneself and go, hey, I'm that kind of guy, this is something that I might need to address? Or is it largely a random thing from an outside perspective?
I don't think it's so random. Now, the source, the root cause of our suffering isn't always necessarily our main concern. And how and where it shows up, is often, it's kind of a mystery. It can be often, later we can do a kind of an inquiry, an investigation into that. But sometimes things happen.
Yeah.
And there's then the only, like tragedy, and so there's not a whole lot of sense to be made of, well, why did why do these terrible things happen? Why do people do certain things? Why do kind of these random tragedies? Well, we may never be able to necessarily, some people like to say there's a reason for everything. Well, maybe the reason is just to.
Well, Graham has disappeared, and I don't know why. So, on the assumption that he's going to be back in a minute, I shall just keep talking. Isn't it interesting that the gut? Ah, here he is. He has come back. Welcome back.
Yeah, I don't know. I just
Pop out of existence. I had hardly any time to talk at all, and then you had returned.
I was just saying, that sometimes the only sense to be made of crisis and chaos is how we respond to it. Like how do we show up for it? How do we surround a difficult situation? Now, if that's as an individual, sometimes it is. How do we if we're all by our lonesome in a situation, things get rough. We're in a critical situation, maybe even life-threatening. How are we going to show up for ourselves? There's no sense to be made if we get caught in an avalanche or a flood, or we fall down a cliff. Essentially, maybe the only answer may be is how do we show up in these situations? How do we surround a difficult situation as the individual and then as the community to bring some coherence, to bring some stability, some love, and some clarity around it? And maybe that's the only sense that we can make of certain situations, particularly if they're incredibly random.
Yeah, and clarity. I find a great deal of trauma, might not be the right word, but miscommunication, making the wrong decisions is clarity oriented. So anything that can bring clarity to a situation, I'm all for clarity in business, in relationships, and in so I bring everything obviously round to a survival situation, but clarity about where you are, what's going on, who is who, is huge. It's a huge thing. I've loved learning new things today. Where are we going to go from here, though? Have we got time to carry on with something today? Have we got a part 3? Where we go? We're going from acceptance, turning up, and inner wisdom. Where do we go? Where do we go from here?
Yeah. So I think that we've kind of gone from kind of just deepening a sense of an acceptance for who we are, how we show up for a situation, and just placing our attention there. It's because we know that we're not, we're going to do our best. On the other hand, where we went today was to agree that there's this other part of us and have a kind of a respect and reverence for this part of us, much more so than we have in the past. And I think it's critical that, that we do this to develop the sense of intuition and this inner wisdom and start to listen to that part of us and develop a practice around that. That's what I do. As a matter of fact, I've taken everything I know in my coaching business and in my experience, and I've put it all into a course that I'm launching in July. If anybody's interested in that, please leave me a message and get a hold of me.
Send me the link, and I'll pop it in the description of this video. In fact,
yeah. And just to kind of, I guess maybe we can wrap up on this. I wanted to touch on this last thing that you said about being, being aware and intelligent about where we are. And we can see that, particularly in the world, I think that there's a lot of the troubles that we're experiencing in the world and suffering is because we haven't given this part of ourselves enough respect and reverence. And what I mean by that is too often we consider, our intelligence and our logic around crisis and community as an intellectual exercise. And we get stuck in our head, and therefore we start to argue about ideology, ways of doing things, my logic versus your logic, and we wind up arguing around things that we're we're this close on, but we're,
Yeah.
you know, but we're never making that connection because we're stuck here in the head, and we're never dropping into the heart. We're never allowing ourselves to lead with this other part of us, because we, in general, there's just not enough trust and safety in society to be able to do that, because for thousands of years we've been kind of, you know, with the, you know, threatening each other in so many ways, and not just threatening each other, but really doing a lot of harm. And so I'd love to continue this conversation. I think that, and also like within the context of survival and wilderness survival, it's one of my favorite topics. I think I'd talk, you know, about it for hours on end. So I think if we did a part 3, I would be really happy and excited to do so.
That's fantastic to hear. Graham, it's been an absolute pleasure, and quite a long time since part 1.
Let's not wait so long.
Let's not wait so long. Comments, do throw them in. I'll be putting a link to Graham's course in the comments. Any questions you have, anything you'd like to add to the conversation we've just had, stick that in the comments. I'll be reading every single one of them and responding, because it's a big topic, and it's something that it's not just something, as you said, it's not something that you do. It's the bolting the stable door when the horse has already ran away. This is something that we need to be aware of and be part of our toolkit.
I think you said it so well. There's the doing and then there's the being. And so I guess we're just marrying the two, having an equal respect for those things and an equal reverence for them. And if you want to develop a sense of mental toughness, well, get tough about doing this one thing, which is seeing your emotional hidden limitations and actually partner up with somebody to do that, because those limitations were created in relationship and they might necessarily have to be undone in relationship. So, you know, partner up with somebody who knows how to do this kind of work. And
fantastic. Graham, an absolute pleasure. And I'll see you next time. Stay well. See you later, guys.
You too, Steve. Very grateful. And thanks to everybody who took the time to join us here.